Hi there, my name is Kendra Morton, and I'm a Principal Product Marketing Manager here at Revenera. We are very excited to bring you an excerpt from a panel discussion we held at one of our open source exchange events. What follows is a short but impactful segment where our experts talk about the evolving role of the software bill of materials. It's a hot topic for application security management, and these professionals have valuable insight to help you break through the SBOM noise, and we hope you enjoy.
Executive order was issued back in May of 2021. It was kind of an overarching goal of overall improving the cybersecurity in U.S. government. And it had several sections in there, some procedural, some tactical, some around tooling. One of the sections really talked about software bill of material as a way to provide more transparency into the software that the U.S. government purchases. So over the next year or so, NIST, which is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, was tasked with two things. One was to collaborate with industry, private sector, academia, and others, and come up with best practices, tooling requirements, guidelines, and ultimately a document writing up the suggested process, along with starting up a labeling effort. So similar to the Energy Star label on your appliances, that they are energy efficient. The idea is that we will label software that it is more trustworthy having the label than not having the label. So similar to OpenChain in that they are following the right procedures and right application security measures to make sure that when you are purchasing the software that you have more confidence that they've done the right work to improve the chances that you will not have a security vulnerability. Since then, so about a little year and a half later or so, CISA, which is Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency in the U.S. government, has taken over SBOMs. They are further maturing it. There are weekly calls to talk about SBOM standards, use cases, tooling development, and so forth. So that is an activity that's going on. And then in mid-September, Office of the President released a memo that essentially said that we are now going to start enforcing this. And agencies are now required to comply with NIST security guidelines. CISA is now charged with publishing updated SBOM standards and requirements going into attestations, which is essentially companies making statements that their software should be trustworthy because they run the appropriate process. So that is starting in January of next year. And then federal agencies are required to start implementing these guidelines over the next couple of years. Starting with assessing all the software that they've purchased in the past. So lots of motion, lots of things going on, lots of agencies in play. And again, kind of the challenge is lots of voices, lots of discussions, lots of industry groups. So how does all this kind of crystallize into, if I'm selling to the government, specifically, what do I need to do? And when do I need to do it?
Is the SBOM a panacea really for managing the security of the software supply chain? Is it the ultimate fix?
No. Not even remotely. It's just a thing. It's just a tool. Like software itself, an SBOM is just a screwdriver or a hammer. Everything depends on implementation. And that means process management and how you apply those processes to bringing product to market. So an SBOM is one measure that allows a certain type of insight and consistency of insight, depending on you doing other stuff too, like having a good policy in place, having good automation in place, and so on. But it's an important part. And if you get the SBOM right, it's going to make your life a lot easier.
What does it and what doesn't it do, Shane? What needs to be done in addition to SBOM management?
I would say that the SBOM itself gives you a structured way to access information about what you're using. So it lets you know what's there. What is it? What version is it? Where did it come from? And what terms does it have, or what applies to it? So what license applies to it, or what, for instance, security vulnerabilities apply to it. So it gives you that identification matrix to get you started. But once you have the information about that software that either you ingest or you're about to ship, you have to have things that you do with that information. And that's where SBOM ends, and you're on to another aspect of managing your security.
Yeah, I mean, one key example of that is you need to be able to use your SBOM in order to generate a list of the software that you're distributing for purposes of complying with the attribution conditions of many of the open source licenses. And so, at the highest level, an open source license is a conditional license that says, I'll give you a license to my copyrighted software so long as, or on the condition that you meet these obligations. And the conditions are often that you give attribution to me for the software that you're using in your product. And the SBOM doesn't do that itself. And you need tools to be able to generate that list of attributions that you then have to pass on to your end customer.
Actually, I was super excited, Kendra, when we were prepping for this and you had that question. I thought this is the best part. So, once you get started with these things, you can do a lot with a good SBOM. But if a company just has an SBOM and no particular idea what they're doing with it, their security remains zero, effectively. So definitely not a panacea, but a very important part of a structured solution. And one of the challenges we've had in market, and this is something that Heather mentioned, is the curse of the spreadsheets. And there's an adjacent curse, which is everyone has a different SBOM, negating the ability of SBOMs to do anything in particular. So, this is where the industry is finally maturing, and we're providing the type of solutions that will actually allow us to do better and better and iterate on security. Final note before I hand over to my colleagues is just that security itself is never an endpoint. It's always a process, right? So the SBOM is useful for the continual management of security, which is always going to be a moving target. No matter what you do, you will never solve security around software. What you're doing is you're continually reducing your risk vectors and you're doing remediation to try to make things manageable. And the SBOM you could regard as one of the foundations of doing that in a consistent manner. Nothing more, nothing less.
Yeah,
So,
every time I get this question, the way I look at it is, so the SBOM is kind of the end result of what's inside your product. But if you didn't take time during design, during development, during build, during test, during deployment, it will enumerate what's in there, but you still introduce security problems along the way. So it's, to Shane's point, it's a journey, it's a process. Don't be fooled thinking you're going to ship with zero vulnerabilities and it'll remain with zero vulnerabilities. It's not going to happen. So it's all about prioritization, making sure that you do security as far to the left as possible, that developers are trained, that they understand why they're involved in the process. And it has to be a culture on the team. It can't just be, we're going to build a particular document and that's going to solve all of our problems.
So what about VDR and VEX relative to the software bill of materials? Shane and Alex, can you maybe comment on that?
Sure. So all kind of politics aside, I'll stick to what the intent of them is, right? There's kind of lots of opinions on the value of them, but simplest way I can explain it. So VDR is your vulnerability disclosure report. It is essentially a public version of what hopefully companies are doing internally, which is we did a scan, we identified we're using 1,000 things. Out of 1,000, 100 of them have vulnerabilities. Which ones impact us? Which ones don't? What's the severity? Are there ways to mitigate it? What do we tell our customers about it? So it's kind of a public version of that. It's here's everything related to my product. VEX is more around prioritization and focusing on what is relevant. So it is more of a report of false positives, things that, although associated to the components you use, are not necessarily exploitable in your product, either because the way your product is constructed, which functions it may use of an open source component, how it's deployed, if it's behind the firewall, for example. Perhaps there's less exploitation vectors than if it's a hosted solution. So these are just two tools that ideally are related to, but outside of your SBOM, because they age out very quickly. Your SBOM is static, kind of release to release until you update your components. Your security reports are going to change all the time. So you want them to be referenced and live and not necessarily embedded as part of your bill of materials. So two tools to understand the security exposures for the parts that your SBOM will enumerate.
I think one way to look at it, which is just really lining up with what Alex said, is that the SBOM tells you what's in play, and then other things like your VDR tells you what that means right now. Okay, so that gives you the insight of what that means for you right now. But because security is such a fast-moving field, things are both fixed and broken constantly. Something like the SBOM is not going to give you that insight into today's crisis is this, but it will provide the data to get you started in having that insight. The market confusion that may emerge is that some SBOMs are targeting themselves towards the security domain. So you might begin to think, oh, does that overlap or replace something else to do with security? And the answer is no. A software bill of materials is a bill of materials of what that software is. It's a list of this software with these things, these terms happening to it. And monitoring, let's say, continuous vulnerability analysis is a slightly different thing to solve. So end result, I'd say any good software bill of materials should provide you the foundation to begin doing things like a vulnerability analysis on top of. But no bill of materials is really intended to be that kind of dynamic document listing today's security crises. It's intended to be a library of what material is here. What did we just ingest? What did we just export? And from there, you do your analysis with other appropriate tools.